Well, we're all hearing a lot about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how the Ukrainian people are fighting back. But let me ask you a question. Are you aware that there's already been another Russian invasion? Well, we're going to talk about the Russian Mafia and how it invaded America. This and a whole lot more right here on this episode of Charlie Crimebuster. What some people are calling, well, the fastest minutes in podcasting. Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Charlie Crimebuster. We welcome our listeners from the shores of East Coast to the shores of the West Coast. Welcome to our podcast. We appreciate each and every listener, and we grow every week. We especially want to welcome you to the podcast if you're new to the podcast. We have new people every week, and we're happy that you have joined us. Now, if you're a new listener or just a regular one, we do invite you to give us a shout-out. You can reach me at charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you, and for all of those who email us, well, we have a special welcome gift we'll get out to you. One you'll love, especially if you love to travel. It could save you some big bucks. Just give me an email, charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. We're going to also have a link in our show notes. Tell us hi, make suggestions, give an opinion, even if it's against ours. We welcome that. Anything at all you send, we'll be glad to give you a welcome gift. Or you could just email us and say, hey, dude, we'll still get back to you. Hey, one of my good friends told me to be careful. He said if I was going to talk about the Mafia, he said, you better be careful about that. Well, I jokingly told him I was going to use his name for the contact person. Hey, but the Russian Mafia, it's really no joking matter, but it is a most interesting one. First, it may or it may not surprise you that the officials in Russia for the longest time, guess what? They denied the existence of a Russian Mafia over there or anywhere else for that matter. Or just maybe it would not surprise you at all, because maybe you realize, as I do, that even J. Edgar Hoover himself, yes, J. Edgar Hoover himself, the FBI director, well, he actually denied the existence of the Italian Mafia or any other organized crime here in America. He did that for many years. In fact, Hoover persistently denied the existence of organized crime. That was despite the numerous gangland shootings as mafia groups struggled to control the criminal enterprise, lucrative profits from illegal alcohol sales during the time of Prohibition. Also, other enterprising things such as prostitution, illegal drugs, and other stuff. Well, now there is speculation that his failure to acknowledge the Mafia, well, some people are speculating that it was the mob leaders Lansky and Costello, because some folks thought that they had some embarrassing photographs of Hoover in the company of one of his close friends and his associate. That, of course, would be FBI Deputy Director Clyde Tolson. You see, he and Clyde, well, they were an item, according to many. And then there are others who speculated, well, that Costello had corrupted Hoover by giving him horse racing tips. That's right. Those tips were allegedly passed through a mutual friend by the name of Walter Winchell, who was a gossip columnist. You see, our founder, a leader of the FBI, well, he loved to play on the horses, or should I say, bet on the horses. And he was even known that he would send special agents to place bets on the horses in his behalf. Now, Hoover, he defended his side action by letting people know that he had more important work to do than to go after two-bit bookmakers and gamblers. Of course, sure he did. But probably the reality of it was he was too busy running down the notorious bank robbers of the 1930s. You know, the Bonnie and Clyde type that captivated the nation. And then also, we must remember that his main interest for the longest time was communist subversion and going after spies, especially during the Cold War. But then in 1957, well, something very interesting happened. There were some New York troopers, some New York State troopers. You see, they noticed something going on that caught their attention. You see, they had ran across a fleet of very expensive cars with license plates from all across the country, all coming to a little town near Binghamton called Appalachian. Appalachian. You see, these cars, they were all headed to the home of a guy by the name of Joseph Barbara. He was a local beverage distributor. And Joseph, well, he was well known to the cops of the area. You see, he had had a rather long arrest record. And that arrest record? It actually included several murder charges, even though they couldn't get him to stick. Well, there was an alert cop there, Sergeant Crosswell. He came across some information of Joseph's son, that his son had been booking rooms at a nearby hotel. And then this sergeant took upon himself to drive up to the property. He took note of those license plates. Then he called in backup. They blocked all the roads surrounding this meeting place, just as the mob bosses got out and were on the run. Well, they nabbed 58 men that day. And Michael Newton in his book called The Mafia at Appalachian, 1957, well, he writes, quote, "That meeting literally changed the course of history," unquote. You see, these arrested men, well, they were recognized as powerful members of the Mafia. They were gathering to discuss organization control of the syndicate. Now, the FBI, they could now no longer ignore their presence. You see, even though the Mafia, they had already spent decades without FBI intrusions, they were busy building up legitimate businesses, but they were also laundering money through those businesses. And at the same time, they continued to engage in racketeering, loan sharking, narcotics, and bribing public officials. So, the Mafia did and does exist in the United States. And guess what? It also exists in Russia. And the Russian Mafia, it exists in America. Now, the story of the Russian denial of the Mafia, well, it's not nearly as interesting as the denial of the FBI here in America. In fact, it was mostly, quote, unquote, a play on words. You see, the Russian authorities used these words to deny the existence of such. They said, well, Mafia was an Italian term, and there were no Italian group of criminals in Russia running around that were organized. And I guess there's some truth in that. You see, even the definition of Mafia in the dictionary, it first reads like this: an organized, international body of criminals operating originally in Sicily and especially in Italy and in the U.S., and having a complex and ruthless code. That's how it's defined. However, there's a sub-definition, and it goes like this: any organization, group, using extortion and other criminal methods. Therefore, organized crime. That is included in the word mafia. And this is what we're going to talk about today: how the Russian Mafia invaded the United States. More about that in just a moment. But now it is time for what we here at Charlie call the Courageous Citizen of the Week story. And our story today comes from Florida, Polk County, Florida. You see, there was a 14-year-old boy who was found with a gun at a middle school there in Polk County. He was arrested just this past Wednesday, according to Polk County Sheriff's Office. Now, deputies say the dean of the Lake Marion Creek Middle School, well, they notified a resource deputy after a witness told them that an 8th grade student threatened to shoot up the school. Now, they did not name the boy due to his age. But this 14-year-old, he was removed from a classroom. He was questioned by the deputy. The deputy asked him if he had a weapon on him. The boy said he had a handgun in his waistband. And the deputy, they did recover a Glock 9mm. The deputy also found a magazine, a magazine that holds bullets in it. He found that in the boy's pocket. That had one round inside it. You see, the deputy, was told by witnesses that the 14-year-old showed the gun to someone on Monday. That's what a release said. So, my friend, these unnamed individuals are persons who say something and said something, or saw something and said something, rather. In all probability, these folks saved people's lives in what could have been another would-be school shooting. So here's a post note. Parents, please, continue to talk to your kids about see something, say something. Hey, you could use this story as a conversational starter, maybe. And if they come across something like these students did, they just might remember this story, and they may speak out before it's too late, and they themselves become victims of a school shooting. So again, these students there in Polk County, here in Florida, they are indeed, for seeing something and saying something, they are our courageous citizen of the week. Now back to our main focus. The Russian Mafia invades the United States. You see, the Mafia in Russia did and does exist. In fact, way back in the 1720s, well, most of the Russian population, they were peasants. And they found that they had to band together to exist in order to eat, to live. So as a group, they would steal from the government, and then they would divide those spoils among the peasants. Did you hear that? They would divide the spoils among the peasants. Remind you of anything else? How about Robin Hood and his merry band of men? You see, these bands of men became very attached to each other. They had strict loyalty, and they did oppose the oppression of the rulers at that time. These, my friend, are the seeds of the mafia group in Russia. Now we can follow this group into the time of Stalin. You see, Stalin, he placed millions of people into what they so-called the galas. These galas was nothing more than a Soviet labor camp. And here, those people who were called criminals, and while they were there, they put together a code to guide them inside the prison. Now, this code was translated into what our words call, quote, thieves in law. You see, the thieves in law was that code, a code so rigid that if you broke one of the laws, you could be killed. So next, Hitler, he invades Russia. And, of course, Stalin, he needs soldiers to fight, needs lots of them. So he decided he was going to give prisoners their freedom if they would come out and fight in the war. But even this opportunity for freedom, well, it caused a conflict among the prisoners. You see, remember, they had already been oppressed, thrown into prison, and many of them had made a vow. They made a vow that was in their code, thieves in law, their code. That vow was to oppose the government, not to fight for them. So, those who refused to fight, well, they remained in the labor camps, loyal to one another, and they became quite good at corrupting, bribing, and extorting the guards, even to the point that they could have luxury suites while in prison, along with the best status. That status allowed them to operate their groups both in and out of the labor camps. So you see, my friend, corruption, extortion, well, it's becoming a way of life for these so-called criminals. Now later, along with this heritage, comes the communist rule of the land. And now they're in such a country where the nation is ruled by an iron fist. And in these kind of situations, well, there's no accountability of the leaders to the people. You see, the supplies that they had, they were not really consumer-driven like here in America. But these supplies was all under the rule of the government. And such leaders, these leaders, many of them corrupt, they did not really worry about being reelected. You see, they had already seen to it that they would get it with over 90% of the vote. That was already rigged, ready for them. And because they were not accountable to the people, well, they could then barter supplies, food, clothing, weapons, drugs. They could put them all on what is called a mass black market. Then these goods would be used as money to buy off people. They then would turn around and sell protection to the merchants. They would bribe officials. They would use extortion, corruption. And all of this, well, there in Russia, it just became an acceptable way of life. It was literally a breeding ground for corruption. I guess you could say it was corruption gone wild. And remember now, if you were a corrupted government official, well, who's going to stop you? You see, they have that security and corruption because the elections are all rigged. It was real then, and it is now today too as well, because now you and I both, we still hear even to this day that people who oppose the government in Russia, well, it's nothing for them to be assassinated, killed, even when they flee the land and they're in another country. We read, even most recently, of people who have been poisoned and lost their life because they had opposed the government. You see, now, while the mafia existed both in Russia and America, it was much more a way of life in Russia. And my friend, I tell you, they became quite good at it. You see, some of these Russian criminals, well, they began to migrate to America. And among the first ones, well, they appeared to be mostly just sort of scam artists. You see, example of this is a group that came here in 1970s. They were known as the Potato Back Gang. You see, these were a group of people, they disguised themselves, now get this, as diamond merchants. They were selling, quote, antique golden rubles. And they gave people here a really good deal. However, when it came to the delivery of these rubles, well, they did not get sacks of antique rubles. Nope. They simply got sacks of potatoes. Therefore, they were named the Potato Bag Gang, the PBGs of Russia. Now, there's another earlier story that comes to the surface of the mob. It shows that these criminals, well, they must have brought their Russian vodka with them as they came. Because there's one story about a businessman who was kidnapped. He was held for a ransom. But the criminals that were holding him, well, they were so elated about their prize kidnapped victim. Well, they decided they were going to celebrate a little early, and they got drunk. Oh, man, they got so drunk that the kidnapped victim, well, the businessman, he simply walked away while they were passed out, too drunk to walk, much less than to chase him down. You see, these were the so-called Keystone Cop-like criminals. I guess this would be a good time for us to share with you what we do every week, our own crazy crook story here in America. And this one, well, it's right here in Orlando. You see, a judge issued an arrest warrant this past Wednesday for a New Jersey woman, now get this, who appeared in a viral video. You may have seen it. She was riding a motorized suitcase through the Orlando International Airport. Now get this, riding a suitcase. That's right, you heard me right. I didn't misspeak, you didn't mishear. It was a motorized suitcase. And she was riding it while being pursued in the airport by a police officer. Yes, Miss Alston, she was 32 years of age. And get this, not only did she try to get away from a cop on a motorized suitcase, she just recently, as of last Wednesday, she failed to appear for court in her trial for felony charges on battery on a law enforcement officer and other charges. You see, once he called her, she wasn't too happy about it. Now, as her trial was scheduled to get underway, well, all of a sudden she could not be found inside the Orange County Courthouse. Her attorney, he said, well, he had been unable to contact her by phone. So when she's caught, you better believe it, my friend, we don't mess around here in Florida. Nope, the po-po, they're going to get her. They're going to extradite her back to Florida, wherever she is when she's arrested. That was according to the judge's order. And also, Alston, well, she was barred from boarding an airplane last year again, because the airline workers, they believed that she appeared intoxicated. And that video that went viral, well, it did capture It was captured on a police officer's body-worn camera. It showed Alston leaving that gate area riding a motorized suitcase. And the officer, he's following behind her on a bicycle. And here's what he says. That's what Officer Andrew Mumman said. He said, "We're going to have a bike pursuing a suitcase in a minute." Said that over the radio. That's as he tried to catch up Alston and to escort her to a secured area of the airport. Well, Alston, she was later accused of spitting on the officer. Caused more, now get this, once they put her in the patrol car, she didn't want to ride in that patrol car. She wanted to get back on that suitcase, apparently, because she did, now get this, over $1,000 damage to his patrol car. That's what the records allege. Well, she pleaded not guilty, but if she's convicted, now get this, she could face up to 5 years of prison. Now, my friend, I want you to know that she was dumb. Not only, in fact, she tried to elude police on a suitcase, but the prosecutors, you see, they offered her a plea deal that would have spared any additional jail time beyond the 20 days that she had served. Upon that plea agreement, well, she would have been placed on supervised probation for 2 years. She also would be required to pay over $1,000, $1,222, restitution to the police department for that damaged patrol car. And she would be required to take an anger management course. But, of course, no. This crazy crook who tried to elude on a suitcase, she refused the deal. She wanted to go to court. But now get this. The court she wanted to go to, she didn't even appear to that court. Well, now, you can see. You can see how this lady really is our crazy crook story of the week. All right, now back to the invasion of the Russian Mafia. In the 1980s, the U.S. expanded its immigration policy, and my friend, that opened the doors to many Russians migrating to the United States. Now, please, let me give a disclaimer. Just as not all immigrants from Italy or anywhere else are criminals, so it is with Russians. There are millions of good people who migrate to our country, good Russians. And remember, our ancestors, well, they as well migrated to the land of the free. In fact, there was one gentleman, a police officer, who went on a special program to embed with the national police there in Russia. He writes about his experience, and he says, now get this, he met some of the warmest, most caring people on earth right there in Russia. So along with this expanded migration, well, there came a ton of good Russian people who migrated to the country. But there was also a group who weren't so good. Now, this large group was mostly Jewish Russian people, and they migrated, settled into the Brighton Beach area of New York. That became known as Little Odessa. But among those people, well, there were a number of people who had been a part of the Russian Mafia. And remember now, they're very good at hiding their criminal enterprise, because they were already very good at hiding from the KGB. So it became quite easily for them to live among us and to conduct their criminal enterprises many times unnoticed. But then in the 1990s to 2000, well, we had the collapse of the Soviet Union. Their criminal groups took over the Russian economy. Now, along with this, there are a lot of people who are out of jobs. In fact, many of them were ex-KGB agents. They easily found work in the Russian mob. Also, there were veterans of the Afghan War. They became great soldiers for the Russian Mafia. Then there were many athletes. They too needed a job, so they easily became the muscle of the Mafia. So now we have brains, but we also have brute. And along with those, well, there were the politicians. Yep, the politicians who had the brains to go along with the brute. They also integrated many of them into the Mafia. They could now work smarter, armed with soldiers with muscle to extort business people and sell so-called protection. So these are the type of some of the Russian Mafia that are now coming to America to join with the Mafia that was already here. It's a big step up from the potato gang and the dumb crooks who let their kidnapped businessmen simply walk away. In fact, there's a recorded gangster meeting that happened there in Russia. The bosses were all called to a summit to organize, energize the criminal element. They went over then who would control what and set plans to take over a lot of the post-communist states of Russia that had now dissolved. Now, in that same meeting, it was decided that they would send a very rueful man, I should say. We'll call him Ivan. It was really known, when you translate his name in Russia, it's known as the Little Japanese. He was sent to Brighton Beach in 1992, there to take over the Russian organized crime groups. And get this, within 1 year he built an international operation, including but not limited to narcotics, money laundering, prostitution, human trafficking, and other criminal activity. He had also connected and cooperated with the American Mafia, the Colombian cartels, connected to groups as far away as Miami, Los Angeles, Boston, and many other American cities. Most significantly, though, it was also alleged that this guy that they called the Little Japanese, Ivan, well, he was also sent here, now get this, quote, unquote, because he was killing too many people in Russia. You see, to show you how brutal these criminals can be, there was a well-known method that they would use to get businessmen to pay up for their protection. They would simply get a homeless person, take him out of the country, bury him in the ground, with only his head above the ground. He was still breathing, still talking, but he was buried in the ground. They would then bring their target, the one that they're trying to extort money from or to have them help them do something illegal. Well, they would bring that person and show them what would happen if they did not go along, because right there in front of him, they would take him out to where that man was buried with his head out of the ground, and they'd simply lop off his head with a large knife. The lesson was, if you don't do what we say, this will happen to you. No wonder he was able to get people to build his enterprise. By the way, his reign ended in 1995. He was arrested then for an extortion charge of attempting to extort $3.5 million from a financial institution, Merrill Lynch. You see, while they are and can be violent, today they would rather attempt to take funds in a much easier way. They are continually working at angles to steal money. Now, the Russian Mafia in the U.S., they were supported by a large crime enterprise. The United Nations, well, they reported in a report that the number of individuals involved in organized crime in Russia was at least 3 million people in 5,700 groups. And now, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, well, they could not barter with stolen, they could now barter with other things, not just clothing, not just drugs, but now they could use stolen military helicopters. And reports of even using submarines now for cocaine smuggling. Then, well, you know this story. Comes the early 2000s. You know what happened next, right? Yep, 9/11 happens. The world as we know it, well, it changes. And the FBI, almost all agencies, they take their eye off the mafia. They place their resources on counterterrorism. And now, these are some things that we know about the Russian Mafia today. Because of that ignoring the Russian Mafia as we begin to go after terrorists, well, some people have called the last few decades, well, the golden era of the operations for Russian Mafia because of our attention to the terrorist threat. And the Odessa Mafia, the one I told you about earlier, well, there in Brighton Beach, well, it's the most prominent and dominant Russian criminal group operating in the U.S. Its headquarters there in Brighton Beach. The Armenian Power, that's commonly known as AP, that's a California-based criminal syndicate, tied both to Russian and American organized crime. And while these mafias are loosely organized groups, they do cooperate in matters of mutual interest. They use their networks for particular needs. The East Coast, well, it cooperates and communicates with the West Coast. And they all cooperate and communicate with criminal groups in Russia. So yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. And yes, America, there is a Russian Mafia. And it is real. I think it can best be summed up with a story from one of the lead United States investigators. He was lecturing to a group of district attorneys in a meeting in North Carolina. At the break, well, some investigators came and said, well, I'm having problems in Washington with Russians. That's not surprising, being that it's our capital. Plenty of targets there for corruption. Then there was another one came from New York. Again, not surprising. Then another walked up and said, I'm having problems in New York. And then one came from Baltimore. I'm having problems in Baltimore. Again, no surprise. But then one comes up from Alabama, another one from Florida, and on, speaking about Russian organized crime. Yes, perhaps it has indeed been a golden era for their expansion. So the Russian Mafia is alive and working in the U.S. and other countries. Even just this morning, I was listening to a news report of Russian agents now working in Mexico, assisting Russians into entering the U.S. through our open borders there. You can rest assured, thousands of people invading our country from Mexico, I can bet you the Russian Mafia people are coming as well, along with terrorists, sex offenders, and others. So quickly, in wrapping it up, what are the lessons we learned from the Russian Mafia of the U.S.? First, be careful not to get involved with them in the first place. They're working smarter now. They're on the cutting edge of new scam tactics to rid you of your money. You see, friend, if it's too good to be true, it is exactly that. Avoid these online artists that may disguise themselves. They may appear to be someone they're not. Dating scams are out there by the thousands, false sweepstakes, false lottery winners, along with even false job opportunities that can deceive you and get you to go along with their false illegal enterprises. Next, we do need to close our borders, no doubt about that. We can and should allow people entry into this great land, but they should come the legal way, as millions have in this country. You would simply not open your door and your home to anyone who would want to come in, and neither should we open our country without some way to protect us from those who are harmless. Number 3, now while the Russian Mafia can be dangerous, and there are a number of gangs out there, even more dangerous gangs out there, let me remind you that there's another gang. There's another gang out there that's protecting us. They're the brave men and women of law enforcement who can and will stand up to these bad guys who would do harm for us. Along with this gang comes our first responders who come to our aid when we're hurting, protects us from fires and disasters. And then the brave people of corrections who keep the people away from us who have been arrested for doing us harm. And then the military who will fly to distant lands to confront our enemy before they come to us to do harms. So we too have some gangs. We have great gangs that are there to help us. And these men and women, they deserve our support, and you can support them now becoming a part of our nonprofit recognized by the IRS as a legitimate authority as a charity we are that lends support to these brave heroes. You can help us help them for as little as $3 a month. You can be a part of our network. Go to peacemakernetwork.com. Read what we do to support our heroes. Then join with us. A link will be at the bottom of the podcast notes. Go there today. So, my friend, till this time next time, since we've given you some information about the Russian Mafia, let me encourage you, please, be safe, be alert. Yep, for the life you save, it may be your very own.